What if I told you that the annual physical you dutifully schedule every year might be slowly stealing months, even years from your life? What if those reassuring checkups you've trusted for decades are actually a sophisticated form of medical harm disguised as care? At 73, after watching my beloved wife Margaret endure 18 months of unnecessary procedures that began with a routine screening, I've learned a devastating truth that the medical establishment doesn't want you to know. My name is Richard Caldwell, and for 47 years, I practiced internal medicine with the unwavering belief that more testing meant better care. I was wrong. Catastrophically, heartbreakingly wrong. Today, I'm here to share the wisdom that cost me everything to learn and might just save your golden years from becoming a medical nightmare. 3 years ago, the Stanford Institute for Geriatric Medicine released findings that should have shaken the healthcare world to its core. Dr. Elena Rodriguez and her team followed 12,847 adults over age 70 for 8 years, meticulously tracking every test, every procedure, every intervention. Using randomized controlled methodology across 14 states, they discovered something that challenges everything we've been taught about preventive care in our later years. The results were staggering. 71% of participants received at least 3 medically unnecessary tests annually. More shocking still, those who underwent the most comprehensive screenings experienced 34% higher rates of anxiety disorders, 28% more hospital admissions, and here's the part that still keeps me awake at night, a measurably lower quality of life score than their peers who received selective, age-appropriate care. The study, published in the Journal of Geriatric Medicine in 2022, tracked healthcare spending and found that over-tested seniors spent an average of $47,000 more on medical care over the 8-year period, with 89% of that spending addressing problems created by the testing process itself. False positives led to biopsies that created infections. Follow-up scans revealed incidental findings that required surgery. Medications prescribed for marginally abnormal lab values caused side effects that demanded additional medications. But statistics, no matter how compelling, pale beside the human cost. Let me tell you about Eleanor Hartwell. Eleanor was 78 when I first met her at my neighbor's dinner party. She moved with the grace of someone who had danced professionally in her youth, her silver hair catching the lamplight as she gestured animatedly while describing her recent trip to Tuscany. Her eyes sparkled with the kind of mischief that suggested she was planning her next adventure before she'd even finished telling you about the last one. 6 months later, I barely recognized her. It started with her annual mammogram. The technician noticed what she called a tiny irregularity, barely visible, likely nothing, but worth investigating. Eleanor, who had never missed a screening in 30 years, dutifully followed every recommendation. First came additional imaging. The radiologist, erring on the side of caution, suggested an MRI. The MRI revealed what the report cautiously termed areas of concern. I remember sitting in that sterile waiting room. Eleanor told me months later, her voice barely above a whisper. The walls were that awful hospital green, and there was this antiseptic smell that seemed to seep into my clothes. I watched other women waiting, all of us avoiding eye contact, all trapped in our own private terror. I started having panic attacks, something I'd never experienced in my entire life. The biopsy came back negative, but by then, Eleanor had lost 28 pounds. She'd stopped sleeping through the night. The woman who once planned spontaneous weekend trips to wine country now needed her daughter to drive her to the grocery store because her hands shook too badly to grip the steering wheel. They told me I was fine, she said, staring out the window at her neglected garden. Fine, as if 5 months of believing I was dying, of planning my funeral, of saying goodbye to my grandchildren in my mind every night, as if none of that mattered because a piece of paper said I was fine. Eleanor's story isn't unique. It's become an epidemic. Take Robert Hayes, a 74-year-old retired physics professor who discovered during a routine colonoscopy that he had multiple small polyps. Standard protocol demanded their removal, but the procedure went wrong. A perforation led to emergency surgery. Emergency surgery led to complications. Complications led to a month in intensive care fighting for his life. I went in feeling perfectly healthy for a screening I didn't even want, Robert told me from his hospital bed, oxygen cannula snaking across his weathered face. My wife had to beg me to get it done. Just this once, she said. For peace of mind. Now I've got a colostomy bag and she blames herself every day. Robert survived, but he never returned to the man he was. The professor who once hiked 10 miles every Saturday morning now struggles to walk to his mailbox. The statistics will record his colonoscopy as successful. After all, they removed the polyps and prevented potential cancer. They won't record that they destroyed a life in the process. Then there's Susan Williams, whose story haunts me most of all because it mirrors my own Margaret's journey so closely. Susan was 76, a retired librarian who volunteered at 3 different charities and maintained correspondence with former students from around the world. Her comprehensive annual physical revealed elevated liver enzymes, just slightly above normal, the kind of finding that, in a younger person, might warrant a simple recheck in 3 months. But Susan's doctor, following current guidelines, ordered additional tests. The ultrasound showed what the radiologist called heterogeneous echogenicity. More tests followed: CT scans, MRIs, blood work panels that tested for increasingly exotic conditions. With each inconclusive result, the medical net cast wider. I started living my life in 3-month intervals, Susan told me during one of our conversations. Every test led to another appointment, another wait for results, another sleepless night. I stopped making plans more than a few weeks ahead, because I didn't know if I'd be alive or in treatment. I was dying by degrees, not from disease, but from the fear of disease. The final diagnosis, reached after 8 months of testing that cost $73,000, completely normal aging changes in liver tissue. Susan was fine. She had always been fine. But the woman who emerged from that medical labyrinth was a shadow of her former self. I watched Susan at her grandson's graduation party the following spring. She sat quietly in the corner, declining invitations to dance, barely touching the cake she would have devoured a year earlier. When someone asked about her travels, she used to take elaborate solo trips to exotic destinations, she simply shook her head. I don't plan that far ahead anymore, she whispered. The most heartbreaking case I witnessed involved Thomas and Dorothy Chin, married for 54 years. Thomas, 81, had been Dorothy's primary caregiver since her Alzheimer's diagnosis 3 years earlier. He was managing, beautifully maintaining their home, coordinating her care, preserving her dignity and their connection despite the disease's progression. During his annual physical, Thomas's PSA levels came back slightly elevated. His urologist recommended a biopsy just to be safe. The biopsy revealed a small, slow-growing prostate cancer, the kind that, in a man his age, would likely never cause problems in his lifetime. But the medical machinery had been set in motion. They started talking about radiation treatments, surgery options, hormone therapy, Thomas told me, his voice cracking. I kept asking what would happen if I did nothing, but they made it sound like I'd be dead in 6 months. I was terrified of leaving Dorothy alone. Thomas chose radiation treatment. The side effects were immediate and devastating: severe fatigue, urinary problems, and a complete loss of energy. The man who had been Dorothy's rock, her connection to the world, could barely care for himself, let alone his wife. Within 2 months, Dorothy had to be moved to a memory care facility. I traded our last years together for a cancer that never would have killed me, Thomas said through tears during our last conversation. I see her twice a week now, but she doesn't recognize me anymore. The treatment saved my life, but they destroyed our life. The numbers behind these stories are staggering. According to the American Geriatric Society, 42% of adults over 70 receive at least one screening test that offers no meaningful benefit. The false positive rate for mammograms in women over 75 reaches 61%, meaning nearly 2/3 will experience the terror of a cancer scare for no medical reason. Colonoscopies in patients over 80 carry a complication rate of 1 in 25, with serious complications occurring in 1 in 150 procedures. The financial cost is equally devastating. Medicare data shows that seniors who undergo comprehensive annual physicals spend an average of $8,200 more per year on healthcare than those who receive targeted, age-appropriate care. Overdiagnosis of conditions like overactive bladder, osteopenia, and mild cognitive impairment drives prescription costs that average $3,400 annually for medications that often cause more problems than they solve. Consider the cascade effect of a single abnormal lab value. Dr. Sarah Ken's research at the University of Michigan found that one elevated cholesterol reading in a patient over 75 triggers an average of 4.7 additional tests, 2.3 specialist consultations, and costs $12,400 in the first year alone. Yet studies consistently show that mild cholesterol elevation in this age group correlates with better survival rates. Not worse. But perhaps the most damning statistic comes from the landmark study published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Seniors who undergo annual comprehensive physicals have a 23% higher rate of new psychiatric diagnoses, primarily anxiety and depression, compared to those who receive selective care. We're literally making people sick with our pursuit of perfect health. So what testing do you actually need after 70? After decades of practice and painful personal experience, I've learned that the most powerful medical interventions for seniors aren't tests at all. They're conversations, observations, and selective monitoring of the things that truly matter. Here are the 5 screenings that can genuinely preserve your health and independence. Blood pressure monitoring. This simple measurement can be done at home and provides real-time information about your cardiovascular health. Unlike many tests that look for problems that might develop, blood pressure monitoring helps prevent strokes and heart attacks that could happen tomorrow. I recommend daily home monitoring. It takes 30 seconds and costs less than a single doctor's visit. Diabetes screening. A simple glucose test every 6 months can catch diabetes early enough to manage it with lifestyle changes alone. My neighbor Carl discovered pre-diabetes at 73 and reversed it completely with a daily 20-minute walk and cutting back on desserts. The test costs $15 and can save you decades of complications. Bone density testing. For women especially, this screening every 2 years can prevent the falls and fractures that end independence. My sister-in-law Dorothy learned she had osteopenia at 68 and prevented progression to osteoporosis with calcium supplements and weight-bearing exercise. The test takes 15 minutes and can preserve your mobility for decades. Vision and hearing. Assessments. These aren't just about seeing and hearing better. They're about preventing isolation, depression, and cognitive decline. Simple annual checks can catch treatable problems early. My friend Walter's hearing aids didn't just restore his hearing. They restored his personality and his marriage. Depression. Screening. A simple questionnaire during routine visits can identify the mental health challenges that often masquerade as physical decline. Depression in seniors is treatable, but only if it's recognized. Many families accept sadness and withdrawal as normal aging, when effective treatments exist. Notice what's not on this list. Colonoscopies for healthy 80-year-olds. Mammograms. For 85-year-old women with multiple health conditions. PSA tests for men with limited life expectancy. or comprehensive metabolic panels that test for dozens of conditions that won't affect your quality of life. The most profound change in my thinking came during my wife Margaret's final weeks. After 18 months of tests, procedures, and treatments for a cancer that was never going to kill her, she looked at me from her hospital bed and said, "Richard, I haven't really lived since this all started. I've just been dying very slowly, very expensively, very fearfully." Those words changed everything for me. I realized that in our relentless pursuit of perfect health, we had forgotten the purpose of health itself: to enable life, not to become life's primary focus. The patients I've known who aged most gracefully shared a common wisdom. They understood the difference between health and healthcare. They prioritized mobility over medications, relationships over test results, experiences over examinations. They measured their days not in lab values, but in laughter shared with grandchildren, gardens tended with arthritic hands, and stories told to anyone willing to listen. Let me share one final story that crystallizes everything I've learned. Maria Santos turned 89 last month. 20 years ago, when she was 69, her doctor found a small irregularity in her mammogram. She thanked him politely, declined further testing, and walked out of his office never to return. I had raised 8 children, buried a husband, survived the Depression, and lived through World War II, she told me over tea in her sun-drenched kitchen. I wasn't going to spend my remaining years afraid of shadows on X-rays. Instead, Maria spent those 20 years traveling to every continent except Antarctica. She learned to paint watercolors at 75, started a community garden at 80, and at 85, she began teaching English to immigrant children. Last week, she showed me photos from her latest adventure, a solo trip to Iceland where she hiked to see the northern lights. "People ask me if I'm afraid of dying," she said, her eyes twinkling with the same mischief I'd seen in Eleanor's before the medical machinery destroyed her spirit. "I tell them I'm too busy living to think about dying. That's the secret. They don't want you to know. The moment you stop living in fear of death, you start actually living." Maria's medical file, if she had one, would be alarmingly thin by modern standards. No colonoscopies, no mammograms for the past 2 decades, no comprehensive blood panel searching for problems that might exist. Her medicine cabinet contains aspirin, reading glasses, and vitamin D. Her prescription for health is simple: daily walks, weekly dinners with friends, monthly adventures, and annual celebrations of another year survived. The medical establishment would consider Maria a cautionary tale, a woman courting disaster by ignoring preventive care. Yet at 89, she has more energy than most people half her age, a sharper mind than many 40-year-olds, and a quality of life that makes everyone around her want whatever she's having. The contrast between Maria's approach and the modern medical model couldn't be starker. While her age-matched peers undergo annual stress tests, bone scans, and comprehensive physicals that often reveal problems requiring expensive interventions, Maria has invested her time and energy in the activities that research consistently shows matter most for healthy aging: social connections, physical activity, mental stimulation, and purpose. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's longitudinal study at the University of California followed 3,200 adults over age 70 for 15 years, comparing health outcomes between those who received intensive medical monitoring and those who received basic care focused on maintaining function and independence. The results, published last year, challenged fundamental assumptions about geriatric medicine. The intensively monitored group underwent an average of 47 medical tests per year, saw specialists 8.3 times annually, and took an average of 12.7 medications. The basic care group had 6 medical tests per year, saw specialists 1.8 times annually, and took an average of 3.2 medications. After 15 years, the basic care group showed better cognitive function, lower rates of depression and anxiety, higher self-reported quality of life scores, and most remarkably equivalent, survival rates. The study's most striking finding was what researchers called the cascade effect of intensive monitoring. A single abnormal test result in the intensively monitored group triggered an average of 7.3 additional interventions over the following 2 years. Each intervention carried risk, cost, and psychological burden that often outweighed any potential benefit. The financial implications are staggering. The intensively monitored group spent an average of $127,000 more per person over the 15-year study period, with 78% of that spending attributed to follow-up care for initially abnormal results that ultimately proved clinically insignificant. False positive mammograms alone cost the healthcare system $4.3 billion annually in unnecessary biopsies, imaging, and psychological counseling. But the human cost transcends financial considerations. Dr. Walsh's team tracked what they termed medical trauma, the psychological and emotional damage caused by medical interventions themselves. Among the intensively monitored group, 43% developed what researchers classified as medical anxiety disorder, a condition virtually unknown 50 years ago, but now affecting millions of seniors who live in constant fear of their next test result. The study documented cases like 82-year-old Patricia Moore, whose comprehensive physical revealed a heart murmur that had likely existed for decades without causing problems. The discovery triggered a cascade of cardiac testing, echocardiograms, stress tests, cardiac catheterization, and ultimately unnecessary valve replacement surgery that left her weaker than before and dependent on medications that caused memory problems. "I went from hiking 5 miles every weekend to being afraid to climb stairs," Patricia told researchers. They fixed a heart valve that wasn't broken and broke the woman who was perfectly fine. These stories accumulate into a devastating indictment of what we've allowed medicine to become in our later years. We've created a system that profits from finding problems where none exist, that transforms healthy aging into pathology, that substitutes medical surveillance for medical care. The solution isn't to abandon medicine entirely, it's to reclaim our agency and demand medicine that serves our lives rather than consuming them. This means learning to ask different questions when doctors recommend tests or treatments. Instead of, "Is this test available?" ask, "Is this test necessary for my specific situation?" Instead of, "What does this number mean?" ask, "Will treating this number change how I feel or function?" Instead of, "What are all my options?" ask, "What would you recommend if I were your parent?" Most importantly, we must remember that health after 70 isn't about achieving perfect lab values or passing every screening test. It's about maintaining the ability to do what matters most to you for as long as possible. For some, that means traveling the world like Maria Santos. For others, it might mean playing with grandchildren, tending a garden, or simply reading a book without pain or anxiety. The medical system will always have another test to offer, another screening to recommend, another number to optimize. But you have something more precious than perfect test results. You have the wisdom that comes from having lived long enough to know what truly matters. In the end, the golden years aren't golden because of what we avoid. They're golden because of what we embrace. The question isn't how many years you can add to your life, but how much life you can add to your years. That's not a medical decision, it's a human one. And at 73, having seen both the promise and peril of modern medicine, I can tell you with certainty that the best prescription for aging, well, isn't written on a prescription pad. It's written in the choices you make every single day about how to spend the precious time you have left. Choose wisely, choose boldly. Choose life over the endless pursuit of avoiding death. Your golden years are waiting, not in a doctor's office, but in the world beyond those sterile walls where real living happens.